The beginning of the Glock Compact, the Glock Model 19 Gen 2. Glock introduced their first pistol in 1982, and it was the Model 17, which stood for their 17th patent. It wasn't until 1988 when they introduced the Gen 2 series that the Model 19 came into being. Now, there were some prototypes of the Gen 1 Model 19, but the Gen 2 was their full production pistol and was made up until 1997. A Glock just like this was the first Glock that I ever purchased, and it was a Gen 2. And then they continued over the past few years to improve and to change things. While this doesn't have all the bells and whistles of the new Glock pistols, it's still an excellent self-defense, home defense, concealed carry option. Now, we purchased this at AIM Surplus, and it was a police trade-in. And so we want to thank our Patreon family for helping us with the purchase of this pistol, so we can bring some cool stuff to you guys. The Gen 2 pistols were produced from 1988 to 1997, and then came the Gen 3. So there are a lot of Gen 2 handguns out there on the market. This is a police trade-in. I believe it came from AIM Surplus, and we're seeing a lot of police trade-ins coming in for a reasonable price. And I think I paid about $400 for this handgun. It's definitely used, but one thing about Glock is that they just keep running. There were only a handful of Glock 19s in the Gen 1 configuration. Honestly, they were mostly prototypes. The numbers are different, but from what I understand, there's only like 6 or 7 of those still in existence. A lot of them originally were destroyed. But before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and check to make sure the guns are unloaded. All the guns we're going to be showing have been safety checked. Now we're going to get into a comparison between the Gen 3, 4, and 5. But before we do that, we're just going to talk about this pistol in particular. This is really the one that kind of got things started with the Model 19. And it was hugely popular. One of the most popular Glocks ever produced. We have the pebble design here. It's muted, and then we have the texturing here. And this gives you enough gripability to be able to handle this firearm when shooting it. The one thing about the 19 is that it does have the shorter grip, but it's more of a full grip. One thing I've always said, if I had one handgun, it would be the Glock 19. And the reason for that, it's very shootable, but yet it's compact enough to carry. One of the things about the Gen 2, because it doesn't have an accessory rail, because it doesn't have the finger grooves, it makes it really trim and slim. And I like that. It's a very small handgun. You start getting into the 3, 4, and 5 with the added accessory rail and the finger grooves or different things. I mean, it just adds a little bit of mass to the handgun. Not a whole lot, but it does make a difference. But this is just a very simple handgun, and it's very appealing to me because of that. And then, of course, with the mag release, it is that small mag release, which was changed. And, you know, of course, this one is not drop-free. We do have the standard Glock trigger. Now, this one actually is pretty decent because it's been shot a lot, I think. But it's definitely, or at least the trigger's been pulled a lot. We just have the rear cocking serrations. We have the Tenifer slide finish. And this is a really nice finish that Glock did originally on all their Glocks. They went away from it because of some health hazards in processing and encoding these. But the Tenifer finish really hardens the metal, and it makes the Glock slide very hard, very corrosion resistant. You can see some surface wearing through from holster wear, but because the finish penetrates the metal, it doesn't affect it. Of course, this one has night sights, and they are steel. And of course, the original sights are the 3-dot white sights. You know, that's been pretty much the plastic sights of the Glock. A lot of people change them out. I'll just be honest. When I do buy a Glock, I typically buy it with night sights already installed. And obviously, there's a ton of different choices for night sights. Still has the same squared off trigger guard. I mean, overall, this is just a Glock pistol, and there have been a lot of changes. In fact, between the Gen 4 and Gen 5, there were over 20 changes. So while this is still just a Glock, and Glocks are Glocks, they definitely have been modified quite a bit, upgraded quite a bit, a lot of it internally. One thing about the simplicity of the Glock is this trigger. And of course, it is the safe action trigger. And we're going to go ahead and make sure the gun is empty. We have the safe action trigger, which just keeps you from inadvertently firing unless you have a full grip on the pad of the trigger. Here, we've got a little bit of take up, and we have a somewhat mushy break. But really, again, I think this trigger has been pulled quite a bit because it's better than some. Reset is really fast. Now you can see the takedown levers here, slide stop right here, and it does have that small fence just to keep you from inadvertently hitting it. It is not on the other side. You can't switch the magazine release as well. Holding the Gen 2, I understand why so many people fell in love with the Glock. But here we have a Glock 17, and this is in the Gen 1 configuration. Now this is not a genuine Gen 1. This was actually produced by Glock over the past couple of years, and it's a classic model. It's to commemorate the original Gen 1, and this was done through Lipsy's distributorship. One of the noticeable differences with the Gen 1 is the grip, and you'll notice that it just has that texturing, but it's smooth, and it's just completely surrounds the grip. And that's one of the big differences with the Gen 2. When it came to the Gen 2, it had additional texturing here on the back and here on the front, and so this gives you just a little more gripability. I mean, honestly, the front and back strap are really what you grip, is what you hold when you're firing the gun. Side panels are not quite as important. They can be a little bit if you're doing a high ride grip, but honestly, this gives you a lot of texturing. There were some internal changes with the Gen 2, but really, most of all, is just the grip pattern. Some of the originals had a two-piece guide rod, which had the guide rod and the spring separate. Also, some of the Model 17s originally had very thin barrels. You'll notice there's no accessory rail on the Gen 1, no accessory rail on the Gen 2. And then they introduced the Gen 3. The Gen 3, definitely, there were a lot of changes made. The side panels actually are a lot of the same, but obviously with the Gen 3, they added the finger grooves. Texturing is a little bit more, but to be honest with you, this is just a worn grip. So the texturing has been worn down some, but pretty much the same pattern. The biggest deal, of course, is just the finger grooves. But also, you have a Picatinny rail slot right here, and it's actually for a Glock size. So this took away from that really streamlined Glock look at the front, and we added a more squared look. But really, a lot of the same features externally are pretty much the same. Now this one does have one of the Wheaton Arms flat face triggers, so that typically comes with your standard Glock safe action trigger. Also, if you'll look at the extractor, there's a step in the Gen 3, in the Gen 1, it's just a flat surface. Then the Gen 4 was introduced. This is with the slot, obviously. It has the finger grooves, but it has more of your diamond pattern texturing. And this gave you a lot more gripability, to be honest. It's on the back strap, it's on the side, it's in between the finger grooves. One big addition to the Gen 4 is that now we have a larger mag release. And if you look on the Gen 2, and that's also on the Gen 3, it's a small abbreviated mag release. The reason for that is because if you look on the other side, we have a larger slot. Here we have this slot where this magazine release can be switched to the other side. And so any of your Gen 4 and above pistols, you can switch the mag release. With the Gen 3 and Gen 2, they're made with the smaller mag release. Also, the guide rod and the recoil spring were changed. This is definitely a difference. Did add to some of the recoil management to it, just made it more consistent. And we'll look at that when we break it down, because we're going to compare all of these with them being broken down. When it comes to the Gen 4 and Gen 5, they did have extended back straps you could put on here. It made it really thin this way. And you can see the recessed area right here where it actually fits into this little notch. Of course, with the Gen 2 and Gen 3, they didn't have that option. And so the pin is just more recessed and it's just a little bit different. So that is a big change from the Gen 5 and Gen 4. But the finishes on all of the different Glocks kind of changed. Some of the colors changed, some of the slickness of the slides changed. And so there are some differences. And then we come to the newest version. This is the Gen 5. It has that texture all across around the grip, but it did away with the finger grooves. Personally, I really like no finger grooves. It makes the gun actually feel a little more ergonomic. Of course, you've still got your squared off trigger guard. It does have the Glock slot, so you can put on any kind of lights or lasers. They did additionally put on the front cocking serrations. It does have an ambidextrous slide lock, so that's on either side. And again, you can switch the magazine release to the other side. So there are some definite differences. You can see there's more of a sheen to this finish, whereas with the originals, there's a little bit more of a matte finish. One thing they also did was they beveled the front of the slide. There are relief cuts that just make it a little more pleasing, a little more easy to enter into holsters. And with the Gen 5, they started out with their Marksman barrel, which has a little more defined lands and grooves. It just allows for better accuracy. They did do some changes with the trigger as well, kind of get away from that mushy Glock trigger. And with the original Glocks, they weren't really drop free. Now this one will come out, but it could be difficult. You actually had to pull the mag out. And so the drop free mags made a big difference. And of course, this is one of the original mags. It is steel lined. Some of the originals weren't even steel lined. And it still has that 15+1 mag capacity. But the magazines were also changed. With the Gen 4 and above, they did have both cuts, and that way you could switch your magazines. But as far as the follower was changed, some of the configurations of the lips and the design of the magazine, and of course the base plate, it does have more of a lip that comes up. And so there have been some changes with the Gen 5 magazines. But the Gen 5 magazine will work in your Gen 2. And that's one thing, all the magazines are compatible all the way across the board. And so it doesn't really matter. And again, you can see this mag does not drop free. Here with the Gen 5 mag, it drops free. With the Gen 2 and Gen 3, the only option for an optics cut was to have it done by your local gunsmith. With the Gen 4 and Gen 5, they came out with the MOS model, which is modular optical sight version. And this just had the cuts, and it has the plates, and then you can add whatever red dot you want to. And so here is the lineup: Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4, and Gen 5. And guys, the Glock 19 has been Glock's #1 selling pistol. Big thanks to Fiocchi for sponsoring our ammo, all made in the USA. Biggest supplier of ammunition in the country. And also, we love our little loaders. But guys, when you are loading up a bunch of magazines, these really help. Guys, the Glock 19 is really what took Glock over the top. But I mean, this became one of the most popular handguns in the world, mainly because of its simplicity and the compact size, which it still shoots as a full size. Just gives this a lot of appeal. Now, it's gone through a lot of changes, but the Gen 2 was really where the Glock 19 came into being. There was a few Gen 1s, but not many. So the Gen 2 really is the big one. This is, honestly, just shoots like a Glock. And it's like all the other Glocks, but there are some advances to it. But I love shooting this little guy. The grip, even though it's not as textured, it's still easy to grab hold of. This has the night sights, which are long spent, but the guys, honestly, shoots like a Glock. And that's what really makes it beautiful. It's a Glock. Now, disassembly is the same with all the different Glock models. Of course, we're going to drop our magazine, check the chamber to make sure it's empty. We're going to pull the trigger, pull back about 1/8 of an inch on the slide, and pull down on your takedown tabs. And it comes right off. Now, here again, over the Gen 1, we have a captured guide rod. And then we have our barrel, and we have our frame. I mean, this is a Glock. There are some differences, though, and we're going to check it out. But we're not going to get into too many weeds. We're going to kind of look at the obvious differences. Gen 2's at the top, and it just goes down in numbers. Pretty much, they look very similar all the way across the board. One of the differences that I see up front is that the striker safety right here, it does have some bevels on either side. There may be some other slight differences here that are pretty insignificant and small. You'll notice with the Gen 2 and Gen 3, we have a very small hole here. And that is to accommodate the recoil spring. And then we have a difference in our recoil spring system with the Gen 4 and then again with the Gen 5. And you can see the bevels on the Gen 5. Now, as far as recoil springs, the Gen 2 and the Gen 3, the configuration is the same. There may be a few differences. It does have the flat recoil spring, and it does have a polymer guide rod up the center. When the Gen 4 came out, they went to the double recoil spring. It is captive. But it's round. It's not the flat recoil spring. It has a metal plate at the back, and then it has a polymer at the front. And this is what you see out of the end of your slide. But it's polymer underneath the springs. And then here with the Gen 5, it's in the same configuration. There could be a few technical differences, but overall they function the same. And again, that is the reason for the enlarged hole in the Gen 4 and Gen 5 slides. The barrel configuration, Gen 2 all the way down to Gen 5 looks pretty much the same. With the Gen 5, they did come out with their marksman barrel. Now, the one thing about Glock is they have polygonal grooves, and those are just deep cut. One of the problems is if you're shooting lead reloads through them, the lead will build up in the grooves, so it's not recommended. It can actually have a catastrophic failure because it builds up all the lead in the grooves, and then you have a problem. But with the marksman barrel, it was just enhanced. It's still polygonal grooves. Again, there may be some very minor differences between these, but really not enough to mention. As far as the frames go, the biggest difference is with the Gen 2, it has polymer on the side of the locking block. And so here is your locking block. This polymer just rides on either side. The Gen 3, Gen 4, and Gen 5, the locking blocks are just a little bit larger, and it's just metal surface right here. There have been some changes with the trigger on the Gen 4 and then again on the Gen 5 just to make it a little more crisp, a little better than the original. And then we have the ambidextrous slide stop, which definitely makes this a little bit different of a configuration. Now you'll notice that the ejector on this Gen 4 is straight, and this is actually for the 357 SIG. There have been a lot of changes between the Gen 5 and the Gen 2, and mainly internally. And maybe a few of the weaknesses that were in the Gen 2 have been remedied with the Gen 5, but overall this still makes a great pistol. So guys, while the Model 19 Gen 2 is one of the early guns, and it doesn't have all the accessory rails and the optics ready and front cocking serrations and all the things of the new Glock pistols, this is still an excellent handgun. It shoots like a dream. I mean, it's a Glock, and it shoots like a Glock. And one of the things, again, I've always said is that Glocks are the AK-47 of the handgun world. And again, a big thank you to our Patreon family for their support and allowing us to pick up really cool guns to bring to you guys. Be strong, be of good courage. God bless America. Long live the Republic. Thanks to Fiocchi for sponsoring our ham. I can't get this hammer. Thanks, Fiocchi! Let's check it out. The first production Glock 19. The Glock 19 Gen 2. Let's check it out.
Check it out.
The Glock 19 Gen 2. Let's check it out. Let's check it out. Gotta get these perfect. They gotta be perfect. There's something about...
I feel like that camera's a mile away.